Aloha everybody and welcome to Facing Our Future. I'm your host Angus McKelvey, and today as always we look at topics and challenges facing us and our future here in Hawaii and all over the world. Today we're excited to be joined with Kalbert Young and Luis Slavoria from the Department of Budget and Finance, and today we're going to be talking about Hawaii's financial future. What is our economic picture? What are the issues facing the state of Hawaii on the finance front? And more importantly, what does the road ahead look like? Thank you for joining us. Good to see you, Kalbert. Luis, thanks for coming. Appreciate this joining us. Well, first of all, as we kind of do in the show, the elevator speech, 30-second view. What is exactly the Budget and Finance Office? What are your main functions? What is it you do in the realm of government?
So actually, in the state of Hawaii, at the state level, Department of Budget and Finance, actually two separate roles. Primarily, one, we help coordinate and administrate the structuring of the budget. So the proposals for the budget to the legislature, for the governor. But on the finance side, we actually manage the execution of that budget and all the cash flow that comes into the state. So budget and finance actually includes areas of the treasury, debt management and debt issuance for the state of Hawaii. And then also we manage the policies for how the money, revenues coming in from the Department of Taxation, let's say, how those monies are actually meted out to the individual departments to be expended as the legislature has appropriated.
So as the legislature appropriates these funds to the agencies, you come in to see if the funds are available, where the projects are at, to kind of maintain a fiscal overflow or oversight of the appropriations made by the legislature?
Yes, exactly. So at the very bottom line, the goal of budget and finance is to make sure that expenditures that are expended during the year from any place in the state do not exceed the amount of revenues that are actually coming in or forecasted to come in for that same year. So the role of budget and finance is to make sure basically the state doesn't spend money it doesn't have.
Exactly. So another deficit to spend. So this forecast you talk about, does budget and finance do the forecast, or is there another entity like the Council on Revenue that does the forecast? And do you work together to come up with this forecast number at all?
But there is an actual segregation of duties when it comes to the Council on Revenues as well as the Budget and Finance. So the Council on Revenues is an entity that was created in our Constitution that is essentially responsible for coming up with that forecast, which is used by both the legislature and the administration in construction of the budget. And the budget, for all it's worth, is a plan. It's a plan based upon what these projected forecasted revenues are going to come in. Obviously, there's going to be some deviation, and when there is deviation, that's when, exactly what Kalbert says, that's when we step in and make sure that we manage that accordingly.
And on the management deviation front, it's usually when a forecast is revised downwards, right?
Correct.
That you'll get involved and your axes will come out, and for lack of a better word, and kind of start to trim the fat here and there. But there's one of the criticisms, I guess, of the projection model that is used, that you do have this variation. You have these projections that come out that people are like, wow, that's incredible, but it doesn't really match up with the economy. Then you have a downward forecast, and then the biggest example was the forecast as we entered the recession that were much higher than people anticipated. Do you think, from your perspective, that within the projection, how is that internally? How do you address that, or do you work that into your own numbers?
So in my experience, when you look at the Council on Revenues forecast, they pretty much lagged the actual economic development. So going into the recession, their forecasts were actually a little bit more optimistic. And then when the state hit the recessionary times, it remained optimistic as the state revenues actually declined. And then the state budget and finance, I wasn't the finance director at the time, but basically the administration chased the declining revenues as it went down. So implemented policies that had to catch up to a declining revenue actualization that was actually worse than what the council had forecasted. Coming out of the recession, it was the same thing, but in reverse. The council's forecast was actually less optimistic than the actual revenue development. So you had situations where the council's forecast was less than what the revenues materialized. That's a pretty good position to be in when you're the finance director, in the sense that there's ample revenues that were materializing. Now, though, we're in a different transitionary phase where the council's forecasts, while the economy has continued to grow, it's continuing to grow at probably a little bit less of a faster clip than it was in the last 3 years, but still there's a lot of growth. But the council's forecast right now, as we currently stand, is kind of moving sideways. And that's a little bit more difficult to manage.
Sideways as to...
So I'll give you the immediate example is right now, as we speak, the council's current forecast to close the last fiscal year, which ended on June 30th, just last week, was for the revenues for the state to be negative 0.4 less than it were the prior fiscal year. But from July 1st on, where we currently are now, the council's forecast is for revenue this year to be 5.5% more than it was last year. So for a lot of people, it seems rather illogical to go from one day, June 30th, where you're at negative 0.4, to the very next day, July 1st, to be 5.5%. So the role for Louis and myself as Deputy and Director for Budget and Finance is to manage those forecasts. What do we feel is a realistic expectation for revenues? The statutes do require us to consider the Council on Revenue's forecast, but we understand it's just a forecast. The Council on Revenue members are also challenged, just like we are, in terms of predicting where revenues are going to go.
And they have to do a vote, too, at the end, right? And there's a difference of opinions.
And it is democratic. It's democratic. So what you end up with in the end is really a projection from a group, an independent group of economists that have an opinion upon where the economy is going and how that translates to tax revenues. So we're trying to manage that in terms of how we allow execution on the state finances.
So even though you take the council's projections into account, you yourself are working on, your scenarios, for lack of a better word then, right?
Yeah, we don't solely rely on the council's forecast. Yeah. It's a major component because the statute does require us to consider it. But there are other factors. Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism also produce their independent models, and they do feed into the council, but we look at what their projections are. The Department of Taxation, which actually administrates for the council, they have their own review and history of the tax revenues, so we take that into consideration. And then we also look at a number of private sector opinions about the tourism industry, Hawaii Tourism Authority, what their opinions are, construction industry, what the prospects for that, general excise tax contributions from all those independent industries, to come up with what we feel anecdotally is, putting together a more complete package of what would be an opinion of tax revenue.
Are there like one-time factors or factors that emerge that could color a forecast from one end to the other? For instance, we talk about the last one, or -4, I believe was the number used, and then all of a sudden the next fiscal year it's this increase. Were there any types of things that occurred that would...
Prime example of what happened in this last fiscal year was that there was an allocation of general excise revenue before calculation of the general fund for the recapitalization of the Hawaii Hurricane Relief Fund. That was $55.5 million. $55.5 million represents 1% of general fund growth. So if you were to take the -0.4 that you have right now, but take into consideration the 55 that was taken off before the calculation, in reality we're at a growth rate of 0.6.
Which would, align with what you're seeing.
0.4.
Yeah, 0.4. But you have that one-time recapitalization thing, and it's seen as a GET, from their side, as a GET revenue loss. And so therefore you'll have that downward forecast.
Yeah. That one, we did early on, reevaluate how the council accounted for that $55.5 million contribution to reserves. But again, the council is a democratic process, so they decided to account for it that way. Ultimately, it's affecting the overall forecast for revenues that they provide, and that will translate, because there's a statutory requirement, that will translate in terms of how we administrate policies to execute on the budget.
Yeah. Going back to that one question about taking into consideration, part of the Council on Revenues is this 6-year forecast that
yes,
they do, which what we do to create the financial plan. But the sensitivities around, we're constantly, Budget and Finance is constantly running sensitivities on whether it's going to go up, go down, different scenarios based upon what we see things are going to happen. Ultimately, we still have to follow the Council on Revenues, but for our purposes, especially for planning purposes, we have to take into account what kind of fluctuations may occur.
Yes, and the 6-year plan, you hear it talked about, is that a requirement that's put in the law to allow for long-term financial planning? Is that the purpose behind it?
It is a requirement of the executive branch. Okay. It's not a requirement of the legislature, but it is a requirement of the executive branch to provide and budget according to a 6-year financial plan.
But the legislature is a practice and policy. The money committees will also, work along those lines as well.
The legislature has been good in terms of recognizing that requirement of the executive and even taking into account the 6-year projection into what the legislature will budget in the current biennium. So that has worked out very well over the years for the state.
That's really good because you have that synergy. Now, on the 6-year plan, though, one of the things that came up at the end of this session was the talk about the next few years, a looming deficit of perhaps being in the red within 4 years. Can you touch upon that? Is the state, through the lens of the 6-year plan, do we have this red cliff ahead of us despite some of the good numbers we're seeing economically? And if so, how do policymakers starting now work forward to address that in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe I'll give you my opinion on it, and I think Louis should give, because this is about really an opinion on forecasting.
Okay.
And right now, the key for all economists and all business owners and major corporations in Hawaii, including the state, the holy grail is to find the peak. When the peak of the current economic cycle will be, or has it already occurred? Getting to that level of prediction is the key for success. I'm actually still very bullish on the economy and the growth potential for the economy as well as for state tax revenues. So I believe that peak is still ahead of us. Now, I'm very comfortable in saying I believe that peak is still, it's not more than 3 years ahead of us. But beyond that, I am somewhat a little bit more cautious that the cycle will run longer than 3 years in terms of a growth cycle. So how does that, when I apply my opinion to the financial plan and advising legislators and the governor, is that I believe we have to set a course right now while we're still climbing towards the peak, a process and plan that when the peak does occur, we're not going to be in a situation that we have put into place a lot of operations and expenditures that we cannot sustain 3 years out. So that's where I'm currently at. So I'm okay with being bullish and allowing for spending now, and new programs, we should start them now. But we should only start them to the extent that I believe 3 years from now, we're going to be in a situation where we're going to see revenues definitely plateauing and or not growing at the fast enough pace to keep the sustaining level of growth that we envision for the next 3 years.
So you really have to keep an eye then on these programs that are being implemented. First of all, are they still core functions of government, et cetera? But also, okay, if it's going to be longer than 3 years, what's the sustainability of these, or how does this office reformed or functions downsized to accommodate this declining growth, right?
So for me, I set my mark at 3 years. I think Louis may have a
more, this was great because there is a difference of opinion, people among.
Well, if you look at the trajectory of the 6-year forecast right now, and you take the trend that happened in the last, the idea, and I'm in full agreement with Kalbert that the better years are still there. We're not at the peak yet. The trajectory that since coming out of the Great Recession was astronomical. It was like robust. We saw growth of 14%. And then you have all of a sudden this year, this flattening out. But then you have this moderate growth trajectory of 5.56% going forward, which is probably more, it's a good way to forecast because you're kind of keeping it right in the middle. You're not deviating. It's constant correction that the Council on Revenues is doing. So as you look at that trajectory of it and how the state plans its expenditures going forward, that needs to take that into account. But there is going to be a peak. There's going to be a peak at some point in time. Costs are increasing. So what are you doing to create structural balance within the operational budget? We hear that all the time from like rating agencies and everything. This is creating this issue of structural balance. We are in a period of time where we will be expending a little bit more than what the revenues that are coming in, but we also have this $844 million budget surplus that's been created over this course of this robust and accelerated growth period. So, but with that, you have to have a plan to ensure that you get to structural balance where your current year expenditures do not exceed your current year revenues. And that's what the 6-year financial plan is all about, is getting us to that point of creating structural balance within the operational budget for the current year.
Yeah, and I'm a little bit more conservative than that in terms of what the $844 million that Deputy referenced. in that, to be clear, that $844 million was an ending balance on June 30th, 2013. So it's more than a year ago. What that balance currently is still yet to be determined. But I think what we would want for the state is to be able to consider that a savings account, if you will. It was revenue, or it was additional funds that really were not needed or anticipated. And that we should run our business, our state, so that we can stay within our current expenditures for our current revenues.
Yes.
And build up this reserve so that when we do come out of this cycle and we do start on a down cycle, we will have more reserves available than were available the last time we went into the recession.
Yep.
So that if we needed to go there to draw on them, they will be available to sustain and to prevent any need for any draconian or serious reductions in services to the public, because that's really what it's about. It's about providing services to the public. So we're trying to stay on a very conservative approach right now, which for many departments, I think you probably know, seems counterintuitive to them, because for them they think, well, you got the money now.
Yes.
We have the needs now. Why
But
don't
you need to
spend
look
now?
ahead at the future. As to that the peak is still ahead, but then you have the valley.
Yes.
There's one book was famous, Peaks and Valleys. So in your predictive analysis, are you also looking for that valley, that 2008, where you'll hit the bottom and climb up?
Well, cycles, the economic cycles are always going to occur. Everybody knows that, right? So right now, we may be in a time of growth, and that's good. But as we've seen in the past, we know the time of famine is going to be at some point around the corner. Nobody knows when it will be, but we know it's going to come.
Yes.
The question really is, going into the last recession, if there's any lessons learned, it should be, how well are you prepared? Because the problem with the last recession was not the fact that there was a down cycle, because you should have known that it was coming. The problem for finance directors at the state, at the national level, with businesses, is that you never knew how long the decline was going to be and how steep. Those are the two critical factors that a finance manager need to know in terms of planning how to expend reserves. You don't know that. The last recession, the decline was far more steeper than anybody thought, but the more difficult problem was that it ran for much longer than any past down cycle did. And that was the problem the state ran into. It ran a year and a half longer, in retrospect, a year and a half longer than any past recessionary period. So the state did not have that extra coverage. And that's where you started to see furloughs. That's where you started to see tapping of reserves, shuttering of programs, hiring freezes, payroll reductions. The state had to employ those measures because it did not have adequate reserves and to cover declining revenue paths. So that's where we kind of are. Now, the next economic down cycle, the question is, well, how long is it going to be and how steep? And if you knew that answer,
We'll explore that answer, because we're going to go ahead and take a quick break here, but we'll be right back to continue this exciting discussion on the future, our finances, and is the next peak coming, or we must be prepared for the next valley. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Donna Blanchard, and I host the show Center Stage on the Think Tech Hawaii digital series right here every Wednesday from 2 to 3 Hawaii time. I would really love to have you watch the show and see what we do here. I talk with some of the most amazing people, artists, most of them, all of them involved in some sort of artistic process. And our goal here on the show is to dig into that artistic process, and you would not believe what some people say, what some people do, what people go through to express. And these are people who have to express somehow, and I find that infinitely interesting. Not only that they have to express, but how they end up doing it. I really hope that you will watch the show and enjoy talking with some of these people the same way that I do. Thanks, and I hope to see you soon on Center Stage on the Think Tech Hawaii digital series, Wednesdays from 2 to 3. See you soon.
Aloha, everybody, and welcome back to Facing Our Future. I'm your host, Angus McKelvey, and if you just saw in our last segment, we are having an exciting, believe it or not, conversation about finances, our economic future, and what does the fiscal picture hold for all of us here in the state of Hawaii. I'm joined again by two esteemed gentlemen here from the Budget and Finance, Kalbert and Luis. Thanks for being here. Before we left, we talked about the predictive analysis. You know, the peaks may last longer, the valleys may last longer. We have data from DBED that comes in. We have data from tax that comes in. But there's often a thing that happens where tax looks at revenue. You know, this is the revenue loss. Whereas in DBED will come in and look at things like the multiplier. You know, this is the effect on the economy. And there's been a collision between these two analyses. How do you at Budget and Finance try to interpolate the data of, you know, revenue out, but yet recognizing that some revenue out does bring money back in through a multiplier effect or economic activity?
Well, I'll go first. So for me,
please.
so for me, actually, what you have to be clear upon is there is not necessarily a direct connection between the economy and tax revenues. There is a correlative relationship, but it's not always exact and direct. So when we're talking about Council on Revenue growth, we're purely talking about tax revenue growth. It can be implied that you're also talking about the economy, and you could infer that, but they're not necessarily connected. So when the Council on Revenue says that tax revenues are going to decline by 0.4% in the past fiscal year, when you look at the economic data for the actual exterior economy, it's actually pretty healthy and growing. It's definitely not in a decline. Tax revenues may be in a decline, but not the overall economy. We need to be clear about that. And so that's why we want to make sure you see that lens clearly. This question with DBED in terms of the multiplier, well, they're also forecasting what they believe will be economic impacts, but they don't really get to that next predictive level, which is, well, I really care about for state finances. I want to know how much tax revenue I'm going to get from that. And just because the economy may be multiplying, the tax revenue growth may not materialize at that level.
Well, why wouldn't that be? I mean, if the economy is growing, you have more economic activity, ergo more revenue. Is it a collections issue? Is it a paper lack of a digitized processing issue? Where's the
implication of taxes on revenue is always going to be based upon what the current laws are. And so you may have a period of a growing, robust economy, and you have tax revenues that remain flat because you may have economic policies around creating more tax revenue by injecting more money into the economy. I am constantly on the phone with the deputy of the Department of Tax at the end of every calendar month, asking us, like, how are we doing? How are we doing? And
Can you find me another million?
Yeah.
Another million. It's in the drawer. We didn't cash the checks yet. But that's kind of the point I was making, because back during a few years ago, it was the checks in the drawer thing, the lag of processing the GET and also collecting those who owe GET.
Yes. So we've moved past a lot of those issues. I mean, there are still constraints around the actual processing of paper checks, but we have moved towards a more electronic format. We have updated the current processes to make sure that we don't have checks sitting in a room that are waiting to be deposited. So we get a better, again, it really is a thumb in the air barometer around general economic trends based upon what general excise tax collections are coming in, but it is not necessarily an indicator of the economy. It's a loose correlation.
So it's a loose correlation. So the lens is dirty. I mean, because you hear a lot, in the Square Building and around, Honolulu, that, oh, the economy is great. I mean, the tax people are just seeing revenue out. They don't understand that more economic growth means more. So this is a really important clarifying discussion.
Here's an example. At the tail end of the recession, the legislature passed laws that would temporarily suspend the general excise tax exemption, the pyramiding effect of the general excise tax on a number of businesses, primarily subcontractors.
The subs and then the airplane guys and all that.
The initial assessment or prediction was that move would temporarily increase tax revenues by as much as $200 million a year. But any of us in the private sector know that private sector is very fluid, and we will find ways to not pay taxes.
Well, that was the whole reason why that sub-exemption was put into place, because people were basically working it through the books so that you couldn't collect. There was no collection happening. So,
although the analysis ahead of time predicted as much as 200 million, the amount of revenue that actualized from that move, probably less than 70 million. And again, it's because private sector is fluid and
Ben-
dynamic and strategic. We're not, private sector is not going to want to pay taxes just for the sake of improving the state revenue
Oh,
stream.
of course not.
So
That's
that's
too
why it's like,
altruistic.
well, did that help the economy or hurt the economy? It definitely helped in terms of tax revenues. I got $70 million more than I would have previously. But in terms of what was the economic impact,
I mean, was there any type of economic impact? Are you seeing some of the rebounding in some of these sector numbers as a correlation to that, like in the construction industry? Jobs were held off. It's like, we'll wait for this thing to sunset, so we're not going to move these projects as quickly forward as we were planning originally.
We're seeing a lot of indicators, within the state that are indicative of a growing construction economy. We're seeing, not only are we seeing, a high degree of volume of activity. I mean, you go around Honolulu right now, there are a lot of cranes out there, not just in the urban core in Kaka'ako. We're even seeing additional activity on transportation costs between harbors for materials that are going to the neighbor islands. So there is a potential uptick. And going back to that, to the discussion about the trend of revenue, the economists and all of the experts around are really talking about this transitionary period right now. We had this huge ramp up during the first half, or during the last 3 years, that was driven by the tourism-based sectors of the economy. But as that basically hits and taps off, we're at high degree of occupancy, right? 100% occupancy is overbooking. So when you're at 85% occupancy, you are hitting days when everybody is full. So, but now that you've hit that capacity and you see the growth, you can't grow anymore. You can't bring in any more additional people because they don't have any place to stay. But you see this transition now happen, and with this construction side coming in, that's where you see that plateauing that we're seeing on our general fund revenue growth going forward.
Well, the thing is, but one of the areas in visitor, you're right, we're hitting 85% occupancy, but visitors spend, discretionary spend is down and continues to get weaker, especially on the neighbor islands. So do you see the construction as helping to bolster what could be a declining?
so coming out of the recession, it definitely was the tourism industry that led the way for Hawaii. So, and that growth occurred really from 2011 through 2013. Right now, what we need for the next phase of the economy is we need for tourism industry to continue to run at already peak levels. So it is satisfactory for the economy and for overall tax revenues if tourism industry were to run at their current level stream. There is still very little room to grow. The amount of visitor spend, actually, the total amount of visitor spend, when you include room rate payments, actually has remained pretty much the same at the peak level. It is off because room rates have increased so significantly from 2011 through 2013. But the amount of spend from visitors is actually about the same. What we need, though, is if that industry can run at what I call economic equilibrium, where supply has met demand, and price point is currently now at that fulcrum peak. If that industry continues to run for 3 years at that level, it will allow what I consider the next key economic phase to kick in, which is construction. It's construction, and it's secondary, it's real estate sales and transactions. That is looking like that is just starting to heat up. And it's getting strong when you look at unemployment numbers. Hawaii has one of the top 10 lowest unemployment numbers. In fact, on the island of Oahu, unemployment is under 4%. Statewide, it's just above 4%. Those are levels that you hadn't seen prior to the last economic upcycle. In fact, we're approaching levels where I've been throwing out that you have to be careful where you may see an economy that's overheating.
Overheating, exactly.
Because if you get to unemployment under 3%, you could be in a situation where we have overemployment. And that could be a potential. When you look back to the last economic upcycle in 2007, you actually had a situation where for 1 month, unemployment statewide reached 1.9% unemployment. We actually were importing labor in construction, importing labor to meet demand. That is a situation where that's unsustainable. So where we are moving right now, I believe, again, my target line out there is 3 years. I believe we're pretty good to run there 3 years. The big critical factor is construction. This multiplier effect thing is very flexible for DBED, but it's really going to depend upon how much revenue gets generated to the state from construction activity, labor, taxes, general excise taxes for supplies. Harbor is doing well, so harbor fees from importation of materials. All of those things would make a giant component of the overall economy. I think that's where we currently are.
Construction, the big boom ahead, but are there challenges coming from abroad that could imperil this economic recovery? We'll be right back after this break for a discussion on Hawaii finances on Facing Our Future.
I'm Jay Fidel. That's Sharon Moriwaki of the Hawaii Energy Policy Forum. And every Wednesday we have Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy. We've been doing it for some time now, and we have some fantastic guests on there, unbelievable guests who give us insight into what is going on in a very complex, sometimes very confusing, sometimes very disappointing area of progress in the state. So we love doing this. We love meeting them. We love talking to them. We love having their ideas out on the table. So maybe, just maybe, we can all make some sense of what's going on. Sharon, what do you think?
I think that's absolutely correct. We enjoy ourselves meeting with all these people and hearing about the energy and the state of clean energy, and hopefully we advance clean energy for the state. So it's terrific. Join us.
Okay, it's every Wednesday. Okay, Wednesday is Energy Day. Every
Energy
Wednesday, 4 to 5 p.m. Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy, here on Think Tech Hawaii.
Energy
We'll see you
Wednesday.
there.
Aloha, welcome back to Facing Our Future. I'm your host, Angus McKelvey, and we are discussing Hawaii's financial future, the challenges ahead. Is there big growth and opportunity, or should we temper our expectations for an unfamiliar picture? One of the areas we talked about was construction activity, transportation. However, one of the things that's occurring on the federal level is that some of these federal funding sources are in jeopardizing right now from being unfunded. How do you see that potentially coming down here to Hawaii and perhaps impacting some of these major construction projects like rail, for instance, where the big spending is occurring?
So those are very big risk factors. So just primarily in the area of highways, right now we as U.S. citizens are in a situation where the Federal Highways Trust Fund, which is the federal monies that we pay in when we buy gasoline or fuel, there's a federal tax. That tax revenue has been declining for a number of years now. We're in a situation at the U.S. national level where actually that trust fund will be depleted of funds probably sometime before the end of this summer. The implication for the state of Hawaii and every state in the country really is a lot of highway projects are augmented or supplemented by federal funds. States like Hawaii have already undertaken a number of highway projects, H1 widening. On the island of Maui, you got the Lahaina bypass. On the Big Island, you got Saddle Road.
Queen K,
All of these projects are example of states committed a fair amount of money, but the feds have put in a fair amount of commitment. Well, now it's time to get reimbursed for those commitments. Contractors have been paid, projects have been executed, but this trust fund is the source of funds. So now you're in a situation where states will probably not get reimbursed at
the levels that it was committed.
or the amount that was expected or committed. Well, what happens then?
That's the big
What happens then? That's the big question. What happens then? Are we as state taxpayers going to make up the difference for these projects? That could be one possibility. Will Congress come back into session next year and increase tax rates for federal gasoline tax rates, which haven't been increased since the 90s? So it might be time for their increase. But that may create other problems, right? It may create economic depression on recovery if fuel was to increase. So it's a delicate balance. Well, what are we going to do at the triage level, which is the state level, for these highway projects? We're currently analyzing this situation with the Department of Transportation, the governor's office, and our congressional team. We do not expect right now that our strategy or approach would be on this particular subject, that we would in any way suspend, delay, kill, or stop any projects that are already underway. But the real question will be, well, what about projects that are on the horizon we were anticipating? If this situation is not resolved, as a finance director, I would tell you pretty bluntly, I don't see any way that the state would be able to cover the loss of federal funds to do all of the millions, nearly $1 billion worth of federal highway projects or federal support for state projects, that we could cover that at the state level.
This is a major quandary and actually a breaking moment for Think Tech here, because you could have a situation for a long-term project like rail that has a major federal commitment coming from the same pool of money. This could present a major challenge.
So if rail, if I was the city's finance director, if rail is one of the projects that would be impacted by reduced funding, from what I've seen on the rail finances, this would be a fatal blow.
This is a nuclear bomb.
Right.
Yeah,
So if rail is impacted, it would impact me at the state level because part of my 3-year projection on the continued upgrowth in the economy is largely driven by construction sector jobs that rail is already slated to provide. So if we take away the rail project, that could be a serious deflation of the economic balloon.
you're going to have to have a major, you're going to have a major coming together here, because if you are going to make up this rail funding, for, let's say Congress doesn't act, and in the hope that they do act in the future, but to create the stopgap, you're going to have to put a lot of other projects in other areas on ice or back them up, right?
It could come to that. I'm actually, even in this way, I'm hopeful that rail would not be impacted, because we don't know if the rail funds would be impacted by the federal highway trust fund situation. We are currently under that assessment. But we also, I'm hopeful that Congress, when it does reconvene, will recognize that this would be, on a national level, have serious economic implications. And that it probably is something that would have to be adjusted in the federal budget or in the federal revenue rate scheme. And then our state legislature will be back in session in January, and we will have a better indication about the direction at the federal level. So I'm hoping that the administration and the legislature will be prepared with a plan.
Well, I also hope too that, now especially, that this question gets asked of, Colleen, Brian, Mark, and Donna, and everybody else who is running for these congressional positions, because that will be, not only for our state, but for other states, that will be the big issue. Because you're right, if the legislature comes in January and this thing is unresolved and this trust fund is at 50% reimbursement or frozen, you've got a major, and rail, like you said, money's already being expended, studies are being done. This is going to be a Fisher cut bait moment potentially, right?
Yes, I think that we're talking about projects that are probably 18 to 24 months away from getting actually broken ground on. So
A little the closer ones.
So the window is still there.
Okay.
And I think the state can accommodate them for the short term. But again, you are correct. It's really going to be a question about how fast does this economic upcycle close when you have certain risk factors like federal spend. We kind of faced this same situation when sequestration was bandied about. And the state was prepared. In fact, we're probably better prepared than a lot of other states. And we survived sequestration fairly well with very little feeling or sentiment on any impact. But there was impact. So this federal highways could be one issue. There's other risk factors beyond this one too, because on the construction side, that with all of us in agreement that is the next key catalyst. Unemployment or employment are risk factors as well. Make no doubt, a large part of that construction growth statewide is smack dab in central Honolulu. It is rail at the city hall, and it is Kaka'ako. Okay, for whatever anyone's sentiment is on Kaka'ako, massive construction employment is being focused in Kaka'ako development. If you took away Kaka'ako development, I think our unemployment numbers would be far higher.
You could have a potential perfect storm. Storm number one, the Canadian front, is Kaka'ako. If that doesn't materialize, storm number two, the hurricane, is this federal highway trust fund thing. You could conceivably have a collision that could upend the economy.
And we are planning. We are discussing. You have to take into consideration what the possibilities are. But as with any organization, an organization has to be able to look beyond just the current year and basically make the determination on what the capital plan will look like going forward if you're faced with these types of challenges. And I think, under the direction of Kalbert and under the direction of Ford, that's their role. Their role is to kind of come up and look at that long-range plan that would be most beneficial for the state moving forward. Because that's essentially what we're talking about. It's like, how do we continue to move forward? Because we can't stop everything.
Yeah, but now that comes to one of our earlier conversations, and we talked about these rating agencies, that rate us, and they look at things like, our reserves, our reserve funds, rainy day, the hurricane fund. in the contingency plans, when you look at these potential impacts coming down, is there a thought that perhaps to pull some of these monies out of the dead pool, like a hurricane fund, or maybe pull back some of the recontributions to provide this cash or money should it be needed for like the for the transportation projects? Is it an idea? If not, what are the parameters for trying to address this if the state, now the buck literally lands on the state?
Well, never say never, but
That's a good movie too, by the way.
But my inclination is, if that question was posed to me, I would probably say no.
No.
I wouldn't favor utilizing cash reserves to fund projects that haven't begun yet, even if they were for highway projects. I think what the state needs to do is we need to take a look at our current funding scheme on a fiscal year basis, namely debt issuance, and look at what the investment in these types of projects coming down the road are, no pun intended.
Yeah.
And then to make a determination which projects are of priority that we would be willing to fund for the amount of funding that we have available. And I don't view using cash reserves, knowing that there's a potential operating down cycle coming to fund programs that's going to need those cash, that you cannot fund programs with debt. We would want to have the reserves available for that. So my initial inclination would be I wouldn't favor.
You would like to keep that cash for the operational down the valley, approaching. But then how would bond, or what mechanism would you use? I mean, especially since the feds may come pay you back, for lack of a better word, right?
And it's a different color of money, right? And any organization, large or small, has to be able to balance its cash and its debt, right? If there was no such thing as mortgages, a very few small people in the population would actually own a home. But every household will manage their debt like a mortgage and look at their cash flow going forward to make the determination, well, what kind of house will I buy? So the state is no different in that particular case. We need to manage our debt going forward and look at what it is that we can or cannot afford. So, it's not an either or kind of thing. Yes, cash does represent a significant portion of what the state needs to operate, but you have to balance it. You have to balance the cash perspective as well as what your long term, because at the end of the day, the government will be here. The state of Hawaii will still be here.
Cross your fingers on that.
Yes, and with that, if there's one thing that's certain, it's death and taxes. So
Yes.
you know that taxes are going to continue going forward, so there's going to be a stream of revenue. You project out what that stream of revenue is, and you determine what type of debt is the state able to afford, and that's what we're looking at.
We have the council. They do their data collection, taking into account the numbers, but internally, are you always looking for new and better ways, either through data analysis and analyticals, or collection of more inclusive data to come up with more concise, scenarios that might be more predictive?
Yes, but it is hard, because at the end of the day, this is still just a prediction, and nobody really knows what's going to happen. So it's a fair amount of guesswork. I would say that, to capitalize on Lewis's point, is that I would be in favor of issuing more debt, so more GO bonds, if that was necessary to keep these construction projects on the horizon going, because they are for road improvements, health, safety issues. But like Lewis was saying, that would be, first and foremost, we would have to determine how much additional debt can the state realistically afford, and how much are taxpayers realistically willing to pay. And if we are going to have this new debt, because the federal government will not provide this funding, make no mistake, it will come at the expense of some other programs. We will be paying money for debt service that was previously anticipated to go towards some program. So make no mistake, somebody will, at the end of the day, is going to foot the bill for this, and it's going to be somebody at the state level. We don't get away with anything. There's no such thing as free parking. There's
That's
no such
definitely
thing as free
downtown.
roads.
Exactly.
Yeah. Someone will pay for it, and it's going to come at the expense of other state programs. So it is unfortunate that we have this federal situation right now, but it's not something that we haven't adapted to in the past. And there's still room and a window for the feds and Congress to act and spare states from having to make this decision. But options are available. We're open to as many options as we can, to the extent that BNF feels that they are financially reasonable for the long term for the state.
Well, there you go, people. Opportunities ahead, an economy that's rebounding, but challenges, definitive challenges as we face our financial future. But as you can see, the ideas and the ways to meet these challenges are out there. I'd like to thank Kalbert and Louise for joining us this week. And as always, we'll be back next Wednesday with another exciting show looking at a topic to facing our future. Aloha and have a good week.